where we read. I'm Naila, I'm your CEO and your founder of R3, Real Eyes, Real Lives, Real Lives, where we promote knowledge of self through education and activism. And what better way to do that than to read, write, and understand for your own comprehension and understanding. So, of course, we're jumping right into it. We have been reading and we're wrapping up the book African Glory, the story of vanished Negro civilizations. This book has been excellent, and is by the author, J.C. DeGraff Johnson. I will be showing you another version of the book as well, but we have been reading this book. We have gotten an insight on some of the vanished civilizations who are not vanished any longer because we have brought them to light with our real eyes. But we are going to be finishing up this book and discussing chapters 16, 17, and the epilogue. So get ready. Hold on to your seats. I'm going to pass it over to our hostess with the mostest. She's going to let you know a little bit of our logistics, and we'll be back.
Hello, this is Howard Soul, hostess of most of the R3 Book Club, where we meet every Tuesdays at 3. You want to see me, or you want to see her, or our special guest. Usually we have a very special listener. His name is Alon. He's there almost every day, every week, and supports us with funding. Again, because every week we tell you can get us at R3 Real Lives, where you can get us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and now on my YouTube channel, as well as the email where you can like, share, donate for free.
He's here now.
You can like, share, and follow for free, and you can donate. And our special, we give you an honorary badge, Elon, because he has supported by listening and by following, and also donations, and we appreciate it. The motto is each one teach one, and if you're there and you could donate from $1 to 1,000, 10,000, 100 on up, every dollar, you get one drip in the rock, eventually you get a hole. So we take everything and we appreciate it very much. Like I said, it's every Tuesdays at 3. At R3 Real Lives Book Club. You can also, we are reading, like she said, African Glory. Here is a picture of the book. I hope you guys can see it nicely. Yes. And the back, we're at the end now. The back of the book also has a chronology of events. It's a summary, of course. It's not detailed. And then there's also a bibliography, supplemental bibliography of additional books that you can read to support or to fact check the information that was in this book. And I wrote something out because I wanted to make sure I got everything that I wanted to say. So I want to say that in this 16 and 17 chapters specifically, not along with the whole book in the history of the world also, the propaganda that suggests that Africans were better off as slaves outside of Africa is deeply disturbing. And we hear that a lot, and it's been brainwashed in our American heads because we think Africans are this or that. And it's getting better, so the times, now are getting better. But the atrocities of the Middle Passage, where countless enslaved Africans perished, did horrify us. What's even more appalling is that many of these slave ships were insured, meaning slave owners could profit from the death of their human cargo, quote unquote, by making insurance claim. This grim fact means we are likely to have a close estimate to the number of people who died on these voyages, though it pales in comparison to the untold numbers that were killed during raids and capture in Africa itself. The cruelty did not end with the journey. Enslaved individuals were greeted by racist, bigoted men who subjected them to dehumanizing inspection, prodding, pinching, raping, and molested them before being sold. Once purchased, these human beings stood alongside their oppressors who spat on their faces, because now you're my property, after being branded on their chest, only to be further indoctrinated by religious leaders who, through translators, taught them how to act, behave, and submit under the guise of Christian values. And just think of that. These slave owners kidnapped people, brought them 55 days on a voyage in the seas and coffin-like, because in the book it describes it as them being feeling like they're in a coffin. Lack of water, lack of sleep, being chained together 2 by 2. And the priest, the minister, the imam, whoever, what religious leader, and they're standing there while they're being sold and abused. And now we want to tell you about religion. The gall of these little idiot mothers. Ooh, shut my mouth. It's shocking that even today, many of these still willfully follow these leaders, whether Christian pastors, priests, imams, or other religious figures who represent systems of power that were once used to justify such heroic abuse. It's time to break free of this blind indoctrination and questions the legacy of these systems. Make better choices and reclaim your own agency. I'm sorry I went on my little rant. This is how it's so. Let's get back to this book, African Glory. You can reach us every Tuesdays at 3. If we change the time, you'll know. But every Tuesday at 3 at R3 Real Lives, you can get us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, as well as that will get you to our website where you can like, share, follow, and donate. Back to you, Kim.
Okay, that was actually pretty good. Good job. So, of course, yes, we're going to jump back into it. In these chapters, chapters 16 and 17, really gets into the death of the beginning and the genesis of slavery. We've already talked about the colonialism that happened in the continent of Africa, which is conquering another person's land. But slavery and taking these people from their land into the Americas, into Jamaica, into all of these places where you find the African diaspora spread out. But it starts in chapter 16 where it speaks about slavery and the Negro. So she already actually said a lot of what this chapter speaks about. So we'll just give a little bit of reference with my quotes that I've highlighted. And we'll talk about the age of propaganda, which is the title of this live. Because the age of propaganda began to justify slavery that was happening in Africa and justify taking them out of their lands, from burning their crops and killing off all of their animals to making them forcefully into a system of cannibalism, which wasn't necessarily an African way. But if you give people, if you tear down everything they built and tear down their crops and their way of life and the way to survive and to eat, how else do they continue on? So it speaks about that a lot in the chapters also. But I like to just point out a few quotes. Chapter 16, just to start off the first paragraph, it says on page 151, it is generally believed that the history of Africa consists of wars between a few petty tyrants involving a tremendous amount of bloodshed and between various tribes, and none which have progressed beyond a state of barbarism. This preceding pages make it quite clear that nothing could be further than the truth. If you jump down to the second paragraph, first sentence, it says, in spite of what the writers like Nancy Cunard have done to correct the above mistaken view, the Negro is often regarded as a person who has no history worth of recording. And this was used as a justification to call us savages, to call us barbarians, to be able to be conquered. This is what they use, saying that we had no history to record. If you jump down there, it says that Volney, quoted by author A. Schomburg in the African Exploration, writes in his Ruins of Empires, the Ethiopian at Thebes named the stars of the heavens with names we still use based on some happenings in their country. Behold the wrecks of her metropolis of Thebes with her 100 of palaces, the parent of cities and monument of caprice of destiny. There are people now forgotten, discovered, while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences, a race of men now rejected from society for their sable skin, frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe. The art of writing was not unknown to the African. This fact is seldom recognized by Europeans, even by some Africans who have lost touch with their past glory. Negroes actually invented absolutely original systems of writings, says M. de la Fosse. Commenting on the issue, he writes, the fact is more noteworthy because if a white Semitic race taught us the art of writing, no alphabet of the Indo-European race, to which we are so proud to belong to, has ever been discovered. An alphabet has been traced to the Vai in Liberia and Sierra Leone, who have apparently used for more than a century a symbolic writing of their own invention, and lastly to the Nubians in the Keresho and the Mahas district, who according to the English author H.A. Michael make use of this special alphabet more or less derived from Oriental writing. So this speaks about how we did create things. We had writing systems that predate Europeans. We have writing systems that predate some of the people in Africa that even know about. We originated the systems to write, and we wrote about the stars in Ethiopia. We wrote about the stars in Kemet, now called Egypt, right? We wrote about these things and had knowledge of these things. One of the oldest writing systems is actually cuneiform, but it will be something that a lot of people are referring to now as hieroglyphs, or the Medu Neter, which is the word of God, the word of nature. Netir means nature. And so that's what African religion, if we want to have one, but African spirituality and knowledge of self was based upon, which was nature that governed the universe, but also governed the way of life. So you'll see a lot of things attributed to nature in Africa, and that was our writing system, which we created and we did have, just to make a reference. But again, we're speaking about the age of propaganda to put that into perspective. In order to make yourself justifiable in your actions, you have to be able to put down another person. And this is what the colonizer did, because it wasn't only Europeans, just to put a point there. We're going to jump down on page 152. The second to last paragraph, we'll read from the last sentence in that paragraph on down. It says that they extended the gospel of doom past the Niger, down to the Congo Basin, past Luango and Angola, down to the south of Cape of Good Hope. And by 1789, they had initiated Mozambique into their slave raiding ideology. And this is what the colonizer did when they come to Africa, again, to denounce what all of the contributions that the African made, not only to the continent itself, but to the entire world. They put us against each other. It's similar to the Willie Lynch syndrome that people read about, the Willie Lynch letters, whether it is debunked or not. It had a lot of facts in it, putting the young slaves against the old slaves, the light skin against the dark skin. This comes from the age of propaganda and colonizing the land of Africa, trying to scramble the land of the blacks in order to conquer it for yourself. So it reads on page 152, the last paragraph. It says, they manufacture quarrels among tribesmen and set them at each other's throats, taking care, of course, to supply them with modern weapons. The propagandists and the religious hypocrites of the time claimed that however cruel was the traffic in human flesh, the African slave in the West Indies and in America was happier than in his own country. And to quote Professor Torde, this too is an age of propaganda. We excel our ancestors only in system and organization. They lied as fluently and as brazenly. Central Africa was a territory of peace and happy civilization. So this is on page 153. We'll jump down. It speaks about the traders who actually traveled hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles to see Africa and visit different continents in the world, right? Traders and aspect of what they did as a job, but actually who they were. So it says here that the stranger was always an honored guest to the African. We spoke about this last week, about how Africans, the African diaspora alone, is too welcoming, too friendly to people who do not look like us. But when we see each other, we are quick to call out injustices. We're quick to fight and quarrel among each other. But when someone else comes into our country and our home and our land and our territory, or to cause a rivalry in between us, we are too friendly to them. We treat them as an honored guest. That might be a fault at some point for the African that we need to learn about. But it also speaks on page 153, the second paragraph. We'll continue reading. It says, the tribal wars from which the European pirates claimed to deliver the people were mere sham fights. It was a great battle when half a dozen men perished on the battlefield. Some may question the use of the word pirate, but it must be admitted that even the mode employed by Sir John Hawkins to procure his first stock of slaves for the New World was worse than that of an accredited pirate. Okay? And then we'll just jump down that third paragraph. It says, Professor Torde points out that it was on a peasantry in many respects superior to the serfs in large areas of Europe that the slave trade fell. Tribal life was broken up or undermined, and millions of detribalized or decentralized Africans were let loose upon each other. The unseasoned destruction of crops led to cannibalism in certain areas, just as the siege of Jerusalem several centuries before had given rise to cannibalism in the heart of the Holy Land. And just as in our day, the conditions of Belsen and Dachau gave rise to cannibalism at the zenith of European civilization, quote unquote. Civilized but uncivilized they were, right? Tribes had to supply slaves or be sold as slaves themselves, for this indeed was the age of the gangster. So Europeans always put, even to this day in the news, you see them saying how a thug or a gangster is always related to someone of black skin, of the African diaspora. But the age of the gangster started, and it will end with the European, with the Dutch, with those who colonized Africa coming in and putting us at against each other and calling what we know as micronations, as as our kingdoms as tribal, which is a negative terminology anyway to the African to call us of tribal people. We were micronations within ourselves, but this is where the age of the gangster began to justify their actions and to colonize us, which it couldn't be justified anyways. It was just a lack of knowledge at the time, I believe, for us to allow them to come in and treat them like honored guests. So it goes on to say on page 153, the last paragraph, the stockades of grinning skulls, the selling of one's own children as slaves, the unprecedented human sacrifices were all the sequel to this grand finale, the rape of African culture and civilization. Okay, so again, this is the chapter Slavery and the Negro, and it speaks about the introduction of slavery. So we're just going to jump on over to what began slavery in itself, right? A lot of people think it started with Christopher Columbus, and I like how this chapter actually pointed out, because Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We were already there where he sailed to, and we were already in Africa. So it really gives a perspective on when the slave trade actually began, and it points out exactly one of the first people to bring enslaved people in. So I want to point out really quick, actually, before I go there, on page 154, the second paragraph, second sentence, it says the term Middle Passage was used because it represented the second stage in the slavers' round trip out and home. Remember, we were brought out from the middle of Africa, the central of Africa. We were brought out up into the coast, and then we were put on slave ships there and taken across the world to the West Indies, to Europe, to the middle, to West Indies, into Europe, and into the Americas, right? So the Middle Passage was that term that was used to represent the second stage. Slavery had already began before the Middle Passage began, and a lot of times we allow historians, scholars to leave us at the Middle Passage, and that's not where it was or where it started, right? So we'll read on. You already mentioned that the Middle Passage generally lasted 50 days. Howard So mentioned that in the beginning, so that could be found on the last paragraph of page 154. Last sentence, it says, the captain of a slave ship giving evidence before a commission asked if the slaves were comfortable during the Middle Passage, and he replied, they are about as comfortable as a man might be in his coffin. It must be noted that the Middle Passage generally lasted 50 days. And so this is to give accountability to those two, those captains of the ships that claimed no responsibility. They were just transporting slaves. They're as guilty as the people who took them, and as guilty as the colonizers, and as guilty of the slave masters, quote unquote, because no man has a master. But that was what the terminology is used. I just like to put that in perspective for the knowledge of self. On page 155, it speaks about the beginning of the slave trade. So we'll just read 155. Let's see, 1, 2. The second paragraph, last sentence, it says, having become the property of his owner, he was branded on both sides of the breast with a hot iron. His duties were explained by an interpreter, and a priest instructed him in the first principles of Christianity. So all of this was based on religion. Remember, we learned in the earlier chapters is that Christianity and even Islam started, and they started to put taxation on the African peoples in order to basically put them in a tight situation where they had to depend on these religions. And if you couldn't pay the tax, you had to convert, or you had to leave, basically, or be killed. So that was a very big deal at that time. But it's just interesting that it's just pointed out. It's written so plainly, and I don't understand what we don't understand as the African diaspora today, what religion has done to us over times and for centuries and centuries, and still is doing, which causes division in between ourselves. So it goes on to read on page 155. How did slavery and the slave trade begin itself? And this question is going to be answered on page 155, last paragraph. It says, enough has been said of the slave trade and its effects on the Negro, but it may be well asked as a matter of historical interest, how did the slave trade itself begin? It is commonly supposed that it began after the discovery of America by Columbus in 1492. But for its genesis, we have to go back to the time when Prince Henry the Navigator sent his captains forward on an exploratory mission along the west coast of Africa. And we talked about Sir Henry the Navigator last week. So if you don't know what we're talking about, please go ahead and check our last videos, and you'll be able to get a recap on who Prince Henry the Navigator was. But it says that Sir Harry H. Johnson writes, in 1441 and 1442, Antonio Gonzalez and Nuno Tristan passed Cape Blanco on the Sahara coast, and on the return journey called at the Rio de Oro, or River of Gold, whence they brought back some gold dust and 10 slaves. These slaves having been sent by Prince Henry to the Pope Martin V. The latter conferred upon the Portugal the right of possession and sovereignty over all the countries that might be discovered between Cape Blanco and India. Remember, slaves, enslaved people, and Africans were shipped all around the world, not just to Americas, and it merely was happening before the Americas was even discovered. So that is to be remembered and to know. Okay. So that is slavery and the Negro. We're going to jump into the Coromantes, which are of a part of the Akan people that are in West Africa and Ghana, the Kingdom of Ghana, the Akan people. But the Coromantes were people who were enslaved in their own country, right? So it speaks about them briefly, and we'll jump into the next chapter that speaks about them more. But on page 160, it says that the second paragraph, the impression prevails in certain quarters that the Negro under slavery was a docile being who never struck a blow in defense of its own cause or in defense of his own freedom. But this is an utterly false impression. Edmund B. D. Avernge in his Human Livestock writes, the shorter cut to freedom was tried over and over again by the ill-used people. The black man was not half sensible beast of burden, but a man who deeply resented his condition and in whose heart smoldered a just anger against his abdominal taskmaker. The fears of the earlier planters was justified by repeated servile insurrections. These revolts of the damned against the fiends were all unsuccessful, either suppressed with hideous cruelty or nipped in the bud through treachery, generally of some soft-hearted servant who did not wish her master or mistress to be murdered. The Coromantes were almost always the prime movers in the conspiracies. In 1676, according to the contemporary account published in London, their design was, quote, was to choose them a king, an ancient Gold Coast Negro, one Kofi or Kofi, Kofi, who should have been crowned in a chair of the state, exquisitely wrought, trumpets to be made of the elephant's teeth, and gourds were to be sounded with a fell attention to fire the sugar canes, and so run in and cut their masters, their planters' throats in the respective plantations whereunto they did belong. So that makes me think about Haiti. It makes me think about all of the insurrections and uprisings that happened and revolting against slavery. I seen something that said that in Haiti, it was the very first and most successful slave revolt. That is not true. Again, we are R3, Real Eyes, Real Lives, Real Lives, where we promote knowledge itself through education and activism. And to say that Haiti was the first time we revolted is not true. It is a very prominent time in history where it was the most successful revolt and the most well-known revolt in all of history, but they were not the first. Since the colonizers reached the shores of Africa, we have been revolting. Since the colonizers reached the shores of any indigenous land that the African has stood on, we have revolted and fought back in any way and by any means necessary. So that's to keep in mind. But that age of propaganda has continued to put it in our minds that we have accepted something that was cruel and unjust and inhumane, and then all of a sudden we revolted. We never accepted slavery. We never wanted to be sold as slaves and to sell our children. We were given no option maybe in certain times and placed in certain predicaments that caused us to do these things, but we have been revolting since the colonizers arrived. So on page 161, the second paragraph, just to make a mention, the revolt against slavery took a new turn. Scotsmen and Englishmen, among who were many Quakers, felt that slavery was unjust and inhumane. I just highlighted the Quakers there. If you don't know, the Quakers were the people who were very famously known to help on the Underground Railroad. So that's just to put in perspective and put into some modern history then at that time as well. The Quakers is a name that you may have heard of. So let's see. We're going to skip down to page 163. We'll read third paragraph, last sentence. In 1833, the abolition of slavery was secured, and the British Parliament agreed to pay 20 million euros to compensate those who were to be compelled to give up being slave owners. So again, when this talk of reparation comes into play, and everyone wants to do further research in reparations, like HR 40 bill, and they want to study slavery, they want to study the effects of slavery and taking people from their own land. They didn't have to study it for the colonizers when they had to give up their slaves. They paid them. They paid them for something that was inhumane and unjust and cruel to human beings. So sometimes when you're hearing about
Haiti had to pay reparations up and through, I think, 1950. They had to pay the colonizer. And the fact that these people who are in the colonistic system are saying, they will tell you to your face now, slavery was bad, but still taking money, still controlling your resources, still controlling your assets, demanding. So they're still upholding the tenets of slavery, even though they're not subjugating your body on a farm and forcing you to work. They're subjugating your mind, your resources, your body, as your money, and forcing you to be in a depraved situation so that you can then get a handout. These same slave owners are giving you money that you got to pay back at 20% interest to keep you further indebted to that system. All right, I'm done. That was it.
Perfect. Yeah. So, and continue on page 163. A lot of times too, we talk about the effects of slavery, how many slaves or enslaved human beings. We like to just put that out there. There weren't slaves. They took human beings out of Africa, prisoners of war. But these enslaved people, when we're given quotes about it, a lot of people, even in the own African diaspora, will say, well, not that many people were taken. And they look at the research and they look at the numbers and they don't understand the effects that slavery had, where people died on their way to the Middle Passage. Most people died from illness and sickness. Some people were left behind if they were too old, too young, too feeble. So we have to put that into account. So on page 163, I like how it mentions that in retrospect, just to give a number, but I have a poster on my wall I'm looking at, and it says the African Holocaust, millions murdered then and millions starving now, stolen from Africa, over 100 million people. My grandfather gave me that, so shout out to my pawpaw. They want us to forget, and I'll never forget. So it says on the last page on 163, it is difficult to determine accurately the extent of the depopulation of Africa occasioned by the slave trade. One French historian quoted by Widen says it is no exaggeration to say that 100 million people were lost to Africa as a result of it. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the eminent Afro-American historian, also believes that Africa lost about 100 million souls as a result of the slave trade. The estimate might appear to be an exaggeration, but it must be realized that the slaves were shipped out of Africa even before this discovery of America. Again, we have to bear in mind that the African slaves were sent not only to the markets of Europe, America, and the West Indies, but also to Persia and to the East. The eminent Negro, General Hannibal of the Imperial Russian Army, the great ancestor of the well-known Russian author Pushkin, reached Russia by the way of Turkey, a slave kidnapped from his home in northern Nigeria. Now, I wanted to show you guys a picture of Hannibal, and I have it, so I'm going to show you really quick before we continue on. Give me 1 second. We spoke about him already. And this is a picture I grew up looking at every time I went into my grandfather's house, not knowing who it was for a long time. Okay? But this is General Hannibal. Right here. This picture was on his wall, on his door, forever. Okay? So that is a picture right there of General Hannibal. And so next, it must be stressed that many died in the slave wars, and that as late as of 1871, David Livingston was to say, "It is awful, but I cannot speak of the slave for fearing of appearing guilty of exaggerating. It is not trading, it is murdering for captives to be made slaves." So then we're just going to jump over quickly while we have a little bit of time to chapter 17, the final chapter. It speaks about the Coromantee Negro at home. So the Coromantee Negro, this is on page 166, second paragraph. The Coromantee Negro, the Gold Coast African, who had never bowed down to slavery and had always struck out for liberty and freedom, was now freed from the fear of sudden transportation as a slave to America and the West Indies. Jump down to the third paragraph, first sentence. It says, the Coromantee Negro soon rediscovered himself and began to give a full expression to those principles of self-determination and democracy, which the slave trade had modified, but had never quite succeeded in killing. We'll jump over to page 167. It continues on here, and we'll read, Mr. James Bannerman is also accredited with having been appointed the first mayor of Accra, an office which is now being permitted to lapse. And it's very important that we do not mix politics and religion, which a lot of times in our African diaspora, we put those two together, and there are two separate things. So this is what this chapter is mainly speaking about. So an opportunity for the Coromantee Negro to show that he had full control of his own political and social and economic destiny came with the poll tax ordinance of April 19, 1852. The ordinance was passed in the presence of and with the full agreement and consent of the chiefs and leaders of the Gold Coast colony. The people repudiated the agreement and refused to pay the tax. As a democracy, the people were the sovereign power in the state, and they well demonstrated it 100 years ago. Okay, so that is something that we need to remember as the African diaspora, and even being taxed here in America. It ain't just what it is, but unification of the African diaspora and the true sovereign people of the land will cause change, and we need to keep that in mind. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left here, so we'll just jump around. What do I want to mention? So this chapter speaks a lot about the battle between the Fantis and the Ashantis. The Fantis and the Ashantis are a group of Akan people from the kingdom of Ghana. Just to put in a quick summary, okay? Ashantis ended up taking over that land, but they were in a battle with the Fantis. The Fantis made an agreement with the queen, and they were going to be supplied weapons, but the weapons were not to be supplied to the Ashantis. So again, putting these groups that had mere quarrels against each other, the colonizers coming in and supplying one with weapons and the other is not, to put them at advantage so that they can take over the land, is something that's been happening to the African diaspora and to our land for hundreds of years. It's just not happening now. So it speaks about, let's see where we can read. It speaks about that in this chapter, okay? Let's see. It was something I want to read before we end this live. We'll just read from here. Page 176, last paragraph. It speaks about what one of the Mr. Usher is his name. He was a representative for the queen. Okay, not my queen. Okay, so it says, Mr. Usher had informed the Fanti Confederation that in case of a war with the Ashantis, as you will have provoked it, you will bear the brunt thereof without help from the government. When war with the Ashantis did come, it was for reasons other than provocation by the Fanti Confederation. On March 20th, 1873, the Ashanti sent a letter to Colonel Robert William Harley, CB Administrator of Her Majesty's Forts and Settlements of the Gold Coast. And I just want to put in reference for the connotation, Ashanti, if I'm saying that right, it says here that Ashanti has always been the correct title of the ruler of the Ashanti people. He is often mentioned in historical documents as the king of the Ashanti, but the word king does not exist in any of the Gold Coast languages. Every ruler, whether the ruler's over a village, town, district, or state, or whether he pays homage to a superior or not, is always known as a Ohene. And the O is dropped for the identification purposes, and Hene is then added on to the town or region over which the ruler has control. Thus, the ruler of the Ogua Cape Coast is Ogua Hene. The ruler of Abora is Abora Hene. And the ruler of Ashanti is Ashanti Hene. It must be noted that the Ashantis have always called their country Ashanti and Ashante and not Ashanti or Ashanti, as appears in all of the old and new official and non-official documents and books. The ruler of Ashanti is still known as the Ashanti Hene, and officially that title is now in common usage in the Gold Coast. The term Omahene, which is now describes a chief who is not subordinate to any other chief or ruler in the Gold Coast, actually dates from the beginning of the present country. Okay, so it speaks about the king of Ashanti, or the Ashanti Hene. On page 177, I'll just read, let's see.